He thought he'd ride in, buy grain, and ride out. Simple. Clean. But when Caleb Turner defended a widow the whole town had condemned, he ignited a war that would test every principle he'd ever held. What started as $2 on a counter became a battle for survival, honor, and a love neither of them saw coming. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The sun hung over Dust Creek like a punishment from God himself, turning the dirt roads to powder and the air thick enough to choke on. Caleb Turner felt the heat pressing against his shoulders as he guided his bay mare down the main street, past the saloon where laughter spilled through open windows, past the barber shop where old men sat watching the world go by with nothing better to do than judge it. He'd ridden 30 miles for this, just grain, nothing more. His ranch needed barley for the cattle, and Morrison's general store was the only place within 50 miles that stocked it proper. Caleb wasn't a man who enjoyed town. Too many people, too many words, too much noise. He preferred the quiet of his land, the honest work of mending fences and breaking horses. At 34, he'd built something solid out there in the northern hills, a ranch that asked nothing of him but sweat and gave back exactly what he put in. Fair trade, clean trade. But Dust Creek had a way of pulling a man into its drama, whether he wanted it or not. He tied his horse outside Morrison's, noting the cluster of men loitering near the doorway. Ranchers mostly. Jack Holloway with his gut hanging over his belt. Thomas Reed with his perpetual sneer. A few others whose names Caleb couldn't recall and didn't care to learn. They nodded as he passed, and he returned the gesture with the bare minimum of civility. Inside, the store smelled of leather and tobacco and the sweet, sour scent of dried fruit in barrels. Morrison himself stood behind the counter, a barrel-chested man with mutton chops and a disposition that suggested he'd sucked on lemons for breakfast. 3 more men occupied the space near the wood stove, including Sheriff Wade Porter, whose badge caught the light slanting through the dusty windows. "Caleb Turner," Morrison grunted. "Been a while." "Need grain," Caleb said simply. 50 pounds of barley, 20 of oats if you've got it." Morrison nodded toward the back. "Got both. Give me a minute to weigh it out." While he waited, Caleb became aware of the conversation happening by the stove. The men weren't exactly whispering. "Heard she tried to buy on credit again," one was saying with a laugh. "As if anyone in this town would trust her with a dime." "Woman's got nerve, I'll give her that," another replied. "Showing her face here after what happened." Sheriff Porter's voice cut in, lower but no less cruel. "Harper brought it on himself, and she's paying for his sins. That's justice, far as I'm concerned." "Justice?" Thomas Reed snorted. "She's got a child to feed. You'd think she'd have the decency to leave town, find family somewhere. Instead, she stays here, walking around like she's owed something." "Maybe she is," someone suggested, then laughed. "Maybe she's hoping to catch herself another husband before she starves." More laughter. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. Wasn't his business. He didn't know these people, didn't know their stories. Small towns bred small talk, and he'd learned long ago that trying to change that was like trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. Morrison returned with 2 heavy sacks. "That'll be $4 even." Caleb counted out the coins, watching as Morrison recorded the transaction in his ledger with a stubby pencil. He was reaching for the first sack when the door opened. The conversation by the stove died instantly. A woman stepped inside, young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun that had come partly loose. She wore a plain gray dress that had seen better years, mended at the shoulders and hem. But it was her face that stopped Caleb mid-reach. Pale, yes, and drawn with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. But her eyes, green as bottle glass, held something fierce and unbroken despite the weariness. Behind her, half hidden in her skirts, was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, with the same dark hair and those same defiant eyes, though hers held more fear than fire. The woman, this had to be the widow they'd been discussing, walked to the counter with her chin up, her daughter's hand clasped tightly in her own. She didn't look at the men by the stove, didn't acknowledge the suffocating silence that had fallen over the room. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, despite the tremor Caleb detected underneath. "I need flour. 5 pounds if you can spare it." Morrison's face hardened into something ugly. You got money, Nora. So that was her name, Nora. She reached into a small cloth purse and produced a handful of coins, pennies mostly, a few nickels, maybe 30 cents total. She laid them on the counter with visible effort, as if the act cost her something more than money. Morrison didn't even count them. That ain't enough for £5. It's all I have. Her voice was quieter now, but no less steady. Please, my daughter, your daughter ain't my concern. Morrison pushed the coins back across the counter. Come back when you've got real money. Color rose in Nora's cheeks. Shame or anger, Caleb couldn't tell. Maybe both. The little girl pressed closer to her mother's legs, and Caleb saw her bottom lip trembling. I can work it off, Nora said, more desperately now. I can clean or mend or... Don't need cleaning, don't need mending. Morrison crossed his arms. What you need is to understand that charity ran out in this town the day your husband died, owing money to half the people in it. The men by the stove had begun murmuring again, and Caleb caught fragments. Should have thought of that before. Gambled away everything. No better than a thief. Something in Caleb's chest tightened like a fist closing. He'd come here for grain. Just grain. He had no stake in this town's feuds. No knowledge of what this woman's husband had done. No reason to involve himself in drama that had nothing to do with him. But he was looking at that little girl, at her wide, frightened eyes and thin arms, and he was thinking about another child a long time ago who'd gone hungry because adults had decided she wasn't worth feeding. Before he could talk himself out of it, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out $2 silver. He laid them on the counter next to the widow's pennies with a solid clink that seemed to echo in the silence. Add what the lady needs to my order, he said evenly. Every head in the room turned to stare at him. Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. You sure about that, Turner? Wouldn't have said it if I wasn't. The widow, Nora, had gone very still. She was staring at him now with an expression he couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something harder, something that looked almost like anger. I can't accept charity, she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. Caleb turned to meet her gaze. Up close, he could see the shadows under her eyes, the hollow of her cheeks, the way her dress hung loose on a frame that had once held more weight. But he could also see the pride burning there, fierce and uncompromising. You're not, he said simply. Call it settling an old mistake. Her brow furrowed. What mistake? I don't even know you. Maybe that's the mistake. He turned back to Morrison. 5 pounds of flour. Add it to what I'm already buying. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Morrison, with obvious reluctance, reached for a sack of flour and began weighing it out on the scale behind the counter. Nora stood frozen, her daughter still clinging to her skirts. Her hands had clenched into fists at her sides, and Caleb could see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride fighting with necessity, anger struggling with something that might have been gratitude. I'll pay you back, she said finally, her voice low and fierce. Every cent. No need. There's every need. She leaned forward slightly, her green eyes boring into his. I don't know what game you're playing, mister, but I won't be in debt to anyone in this town. Not anymore. Caleb met her gaze without flinching. There was fire in this woman, a core of steel that all the hardship in the world hadn't bent. He found himself respecting that, even as he saw how it isolated her. Not asking you to be in debt, he said quietly. Just asking you to let your daughter eat tonight. Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or the memory of too many nights when eating hadn't been guaranteed. Her hand tightened on the little girl's shoulder. Morrison dumped the flour into a cloth sack and tied it with rough twine. He slapped it onto the counter alongside Caleb's grain. That's everything. Now, if we're done with the charity hour, we're done. Caleb gathered his sacks, then pushed the flour toward Nora. She hesitated for just a moment before taking it, holding it against her chest like it was made of gold instead of ground wheat. Come on, Lily, she murmured to her daughter. The little girl looked up at Caleb with eyes that seemed far too old for her small face, then followed her mother toward the door. They were almost there when Thomas Reed's voice cut across the room like a whip crack. Careful, Turner. Town's got a long memory. We remember the folks who side with thieves. Caleb stopped in the doorway, his sacks heavy in his arms. He didn't turn around. I'm siding with a hungry child. If that makes me your enemy, Reed, I'll sleep just fine with that. He walked out into the brutal sunlight, leaving a stunned silence behind him. Outside, Nora and her daughter were already halfway down the street, moving quickly, as if afraid someone might chase them down and demand the flour back. Caleb loaded his grain onto his horse, taking his time with the straps and buckles. His hands were steady, but something in his chest felt anything but. What the hell had he just done? He'd lived in these hills for nearly a decade, minded his own business, stayed out of other people's troubles. It was a good life, a quiet life. And in the space of 5 minutes, he'd thrown himself directly into the middle of whatever mess this town had going with Nora Harper and her dead husband's debts. Smart, Caleb. Real smart. But when he closed his eyes, he saw that little girl's face again, saw the way she'd pressed against her mother's legs, seeking protection from a world that had already shown itself to be cruel and unforgiving. He knew that look, remembered it from a face he saw in a mirror a lifetime ago. Hell, he muttered, swinging into his saddle. The bay mare tossed her head, sensing his mood. Let's get home. He rode north out of Dust Creek without looking back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something important behind. Or maybe that he'd picked something up, a burden he hadn't asked for but couldn't quite bring himself to put down. The sun was lower now, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust. Caleb's ranch lay at the far edge of the valley, nestled in the curve of the Blackstone River where the water ran cold and clear even in the worst of summer. It was good land, better than he deserved probably. He'd bought it with money saved from years of working cattle drives and breaking horses for other men, and he'd built it up slow and careful. The house was solid timber with a stone fireplace. The barn could hold 20 horses easy. His fences were straight and his water rights were secure. It was everything a man could want, if a man didn't want much. As he rode, Caleb found his thoughts drifting back to Morrison's store, to the way those men had talked about Nora Harper, like she was less than human, to the shame in her eyes when she'd counted out those pathetic coins, to the fierce, burning pride that had made her want to refuse his help even though her daughter was clearly half-starved. What had her husband done that made a whole town turn on a widow and child? Caleb didn't know the details, didn't want to know them, he told himself firmly. It wasn't his business. He'd done a decent thing, helping her buy some flour. That was all. Tomorrow he'd go back to his life. She'd go back to hers. And they'd never cross paths again. Except he couldn't stop thinking about how thin that little girl had looked, how the woman's dress had hung on her like a scarecrow's clothes, how her farmhouse, wherever it was, must be falling apart around them if she couldn't even afford 5 pounds of flour. By the time Caleb reached his ranch, the sun was touching the horizon. His foreman, a grizzled Mexican named Luis, who'd been working the land longer than Caleb had owned it, came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag. "Get the grain?" Luis asked. "Got it." Caleb dismounted and began unloading the sacks. "How are the cattle?" "Good. Found 2 more calves this morning. That black cow finally dropped hers. Took her sweet time about it." They talked business for a while. Water levels in the creek, a section of fence that needed mending, the 2-year-old stallion that was finally starting to settle under saddle. Normal things. Ranch things. The kind of straightforward problems that had solutions you could work with your hands. But that night, after Luis had gone home to his own cabin and Caleb sat alone in his kitchen with a plate of beans and cornbread, he found himself staring at nothing and seeing green eyes that burned with pride and desperation in equal measure. "Damn it," he said to the empty room. He knew what he was going to do, knew it with the same certainty that he knew the sun would rise tomorrow and his cattle would need water. And somewhere out there in the dark, Nora Harper was probably lying awake trying to figure out how to make 5 pounds of flour last until she could earn enough for more. 3 days. He'd give it 3 days. Let things settle. Let the town's gossip move on to something else. And then he'd ride out with some seed corn and maybe some dried meat just to make sure the little girl, Lily, her name was Lily, had something to eat, just being neighborly. That was all. He almost believed it too. The 3 days passed like honey dripping from a spoon, slow and sticky. Caleb threw himself into work, repairing the barn roof that didn't really need repairing, clearing brush from the north pasture that could have waited another month, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering back to that scene in Morrison's store. It didn't work. Luis noticed, of course. On the second day, while they were stringing new wire along the eastern fence line, the older man said casually, "You heard the talk in town?" Caleb hammered a staple into the post with more force than necessary. "Don't listen to town talk." "Maybe you should. A lot of people upset about you helping that Harper woman." "Let them be upset." Luis worked in silence for a moment, then said carefully, "Her husband, James Harper, he was a gambler, not a good one. Borrowed money from half the town to keep playing cards, swore he'd pay it all back when his luck turned." "His luck turned?" "He died. Riding home drunk from a poker game, fell off his horse and cracked his skull on a rock." Luis shook his head. "Left his wife with nothing but debts and that little girl to feed. Town figures she should have sold what little she had and moved on. Instead, she's trying to hold on to that broken-down farm, working herself to death trying to grow enough to survive." Caleb pulled the wire tight, testing the tension. "So the town's punishing her for her husband's mistakes. That's one way to look at it. What's another way?" Luis met his gaze. "That sometimes people need someone to look down on, makes them feel better about their own lives. The widow Harper, she's an easy target, young, pretty, proud, alone, perfect person to push around." The words settled in Caleb's gut like stones. He'd known men like that. Hell, he'd worked for men like that. People who needed someone beneath them to feel tall. "She got family?" he asked. "Not that anyone knows. If she did, she'd probably have gone to them by now." That night, Caleb sat on his porch watching the stars come out and made his decision. Not that there'd ever really been a choice. He'd been taught by a hard life that you helped people who needed helping, not because it was easy or because you'd get something back, but because turning away was how you lost the parts of yourself that mattered. On the morning of the fourth day, he loaded up a sack of seed corn, some dried beef, a bag of potatoes, and a spare wool blanket he'd been keeping in his storage chest. Practical things. Things a struggling farm might need. Luis watched him prepare but said nothing, just nodded when Caleb said he'd be gone most of the day. "Be careful," Luis said as Caleb mounted up. "Town's watching you now." "Let them watch." He rode south, following Luis's directions to the Harper place. It was farther than he'd expected, nearly 10 miles from Dust Creek on a road that had mostly been forgotten by anyone with better options. The land out here was rough, all rocks and scrub brush, the kind of soil that fought you for every crop. The farmhouse appeared through the morning haze like a ghost of better days. It had been white once, maybe, but weather and neglect had turned it gray. The porch sagged on one side. Several shutters hung crooked. The barn beyond it was missing half its roof, and what remained looked ready to collapse in the next strong wind. But there was a garden, or an attempt at one. Someone had cleared a patch of ground and planted what looked like beans and squash, though they were struggling in the harsh soil. Caleb could see where the rows had been carefully laid out, each seed placed with hope, if not with experience. He'd barely dismounted when the front door opened. Nora Harper stood in the doorway with a kitchen knife in her hand. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the dusty yard. Caleb kept his hands visible, away from the rifle on his saddle, and waited. "What do you want?" Her voice was harder than it had been in town, stripped of the desperate politeness she'd used with Morrison. Out here, on her own land with her daughter behind her, she was pure defensive fury. "Brought some things," Caleb said evenly. "Seed corn. Thought you might—" "I told you I don't accept charity. And I told you this isn't charity." He gestured to the struggling garden. "You're trying to farm this land. Corn grows better than beans in soil like this. Deeper roots. Figured you could use some." Her knuckles were white around the knife handle. "Why? Why what? Why do you care? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Her voice cracked slightly. "What is it you want from me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Caleb hadn't even considered. He saw it now, saw how this must look to her. A strange man showing up at her isolated farm with gifts. In her position, he'd be suspicious too. He took a slow breath. "Nothing. I want nothing from you except maybe to know that little girl of yours has enough to eat. Lily has everything she needs. It was such an obvious lie that Caleb didn't bother responding to it. Instead, he pulled the sack of seed corn from his saddle and set it on the ground, added the dried meat and potatoes. The blanket he left in his pack, one gift at a time. I'll leave this here, he said quietly. You can use it or not. Your choice. But I rode 10 miles to bring it, so I'd appreciate it if you at least considered, why? The word burst from her like a dam breaking. Why did you help me in town? Why are you here? I don't understand what you're doing, and I can't afford... She stopped, chest heaving, eyes bright with something that might have been tears or rage. I can't afford to hope that someone is actually kind without wanting something in return. The raw honesty of it hit Caleb like a physical blow. He looked at this woman, this fierce, exhausted, terrified woman, and saw someone who'd been hurt so many times that kindness looked like another trap. When I was 8 years old, he heard himself say, my father drank himself to death, and my mother couldn't feed me and my sisters. Town we lived in decided we weren't their problem. I remember what it felt like to be hungry. I remember what it felt like to watch people turn away. He met her gaze directly. I'm not going to be one of those people. Not to you, not to your daughter. So you can throw this corn in the creek if it makes you feel better, but I'm not taking it back. Silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Behind Nora, Caleb could see the little girl, Lily, peering around her mother's skirts with those 2 old eyes. Finally, Nora lowered the knife. Her shoulders sagged as if exhaustion had finally caught up with her fury. All right, she said softly. All right, but I'm paying you back. Somehow. When I can. If it makes you feel better. It does. She stepped down off the porch, moving toward the supplies with visible reluctance, as if still half convinced this was some kind of trick. When she reached the sack of corn, she knelt and opened it, running her hands through the kernels. This is good seed. Should give you a decent crop if you get it in the ground soon. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the hardness in her face softened slightly. I don't know how to thank you. Don't need thanks. Just plant it. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there and gone so quick he almost missed it. I'm not very good at farming. My husband was supposed to... She trailed off, her jaw tightening. I'm learning. Takes time. Time is something I don't have much of. She stood, brushing dirt from her worn dress. This land is too hard. The well is half dry. The roof leaks. I'm barely keeping us alive, and everyone in town is waiting for me to fail so they can say they were right about me. Caleb heard the exhaustion in her voice, the weight of fighting a losing battle with nothing but pride and stubbornness to keep her going. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself, years ago when he'd first started trying to build something of his own. That garden there, he said, nodding toward the struggling plants. It's laid out wrong. Her spine stiffened. Excuse me? Not an insult, just a fact. You've got your beans in full sun, but this time of year they need afternoon shade or they'll burn up. And you're planting too close together. Roots will strangle each other. He walked over, knelt by the rows. If you move these over here, under the eave of the barn, and space them out more, you'll get twice the yield. Nora followed him, pride and desperation warring on her face. I can't afford to replant. I barely got these in the ground. You can't afford not to. The way it is now, you'll lose half of them by August. She stared at the garden as if it had personally betrayed her. I don't know what I'm doing, she admitted quietly. I grew up in the city. My husband said he knew farming, but... She let out a bitter laugh. Turns out he lied about that too. Caleb stood, dusting off his hands. I've got some time today. I could help you replant, show you how to lay it out proper. The suspicious fear came back into her eyes immediately. Why would you do that? Because I'm here. Because I know how. Because... He stopped, frustrated with his own inability to explain something that felt obvious to him. Look, you can say no, but I'm offering to help, no strings attached. Take it or don't. For a long moment, she just studied him, as if trying to read the truth written somewhere in his face. Lily had ventured out onto the porch now, watching them with silent intensity. Finally, Nora nodded once, sharp and decisive. All right, but if you're helping, I'm feeding you. It's not much, just beans and cornbread, but it's what I have. Fair enough. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, carefully uprooting the struggling plants and relocating them according to Caleb's instructions. Nora was a quick learner, asking sharp questions and remembering the answers. Her hands were soft, too soft for farm work, and quickly developed blisters, but she didn't complain. Just kept working with that fierce determination he was beginning to recognize as her defining characteristic. Lily helped in small ways, carrying water from the well in a bucket too big for her small hands, placing stones to mark the edges of rows. She didn't talk much, but Caleb caught her watching him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and wariness. "Are you going to stay?" the girl asked suddenly, her small voice cutting through the afternoon heat. Both adults looked up from their work. "Lily," Nora said sharply, "that's not just for today," Caleb told the girl gently. "I've got my own ranch to look after." "Oh." Something like disappointment crossed her small face. "Are you a good man or a bad man?" The question, so simple and direct, struck Caleb harder than he'd expected. He set down his spade and turned to face her fully, this child who'd already learned that not all adults could be trusted. "I try to be good, miss," he said honestly. "Some days I don't do too well, but I try." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone much older. Then, without warning, she walked over and wrapped her thin arms around his waist in a brief, fierce hug before running back to her mother. Caleb stood frozen, stunned by the unexpected gesture. When he looked up, he found Nora watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, something soft and sad, and maybe grateful all at once. They didn't talk much after that, just worked side by side as the sun climbed and then began its descent. When they finally finished, the garden looked completely different, properly spaced, strategically placed, actually standing a chance of survival. "It's perfect," Nora said softly, surveying their work. "It's a start," Caleb corrected. "You'll need to water morning and evening, watch for beetles, pull weeds soon as you see them." "I will." She turned to him, and this time when she met his eyes, there was something approaching trust in her expression. "Thank you. I mean it. This is—" She gestured helplessly at the garden, the seed corn, everything. "I don't have words for what this means." "Then don't use any." He moved toward his horse, suddenly aware of how late it had gotten. "I should head back." "Wait." She hurried into the house and emerged a moment later with a cloth bundle. "It's not much, but I meant what I said about feeding you." Inside the cloth was cornbread. Not much, maybe 2 pieces, but still warm from the oven. It was good cornbread too, golden and crumbly, better than anything he'd made for himself in months. "Thank you," he said, genuinely touched. As he rode away from the Harper farm, the sun setting fire to the horizon behind him, Caleb found himself thinking about green eyes and fierce pride in a little girl's question, "Are you a good man or a bad man?" He didn't know the answer, but riding back toward his ranch with cornbread wrapped in cloth and the memory of honest work shared with someone who needed it, he thought maybe he was trying to become the kind of man who deserved that little girl's hug. He'd only come to town for grain, but somehow, somewhere between Morrison's store and a widow's struggling garden, he'd found something he hadn't known he was looking for. He just didn't know yet what it would cost him. The next morning arrived with clouds building in the east like a bruise spreading across the sky. Caleb stood on his porch with coffee cooling in his cup, watching the distant darkness and feeling something uneasy settle in his chest. Storm coming. A bad one, if those clouds meant what he thought they meant. He should have been thinking about his cattle, about moving them to higher ground before the rain turned the low pasture into a swamp. Should have been checking his roof, making sure the barn doors were secure, doing all the practical things a man did when weather was turning. Instead, he was thinking about a sagging roof 10 miles south and a woman who couldn't afford to fix it. "Hell," he muttered into his coffee. Luis emerged from the barn leading the roan gelding, already saddled and ready for the day's work. He took one look at Caleb's face and shook his head. "You're going back there." It wasn't a question. "Storm's coming," Caleb said, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. "Storm comes every few weeks this time of year. You didn't ride out checking on folks before." "Didn't have reason to before." Luis tied the roan to the hitching post and walked up the porch steps. He'd worked this land for 40 years, first for the previous owner and now for Caleb, and he had the kind of earned authority that came from seeing young men make fools of themselves repeatedly. "You know what you're doing?" the older man asked quietly, checking on a neighbor. "That what we're calling it?" Caleb turned to look at him directly. "Say what you mean, Luis." "I mean that Widow's situation is complicated. Town's already talking about you helping her. You go back there again, especially alone, and that talk's going to get uglier." Luis pulled out his tobacco pouch, began rolling a cigarette with practiced ease. "I'm not saying don't help. I'm saying be careful, for her sake, as much as yours." The words settled heavy between them. Caleb knew Luis was right. Small towns ran on gossip like engines ran on oil, and the machinery was already turning. But he also knew what would happen if that roof gave way in a hard rain with a woman and child underneath it. "I'll be careful," he said finally. "Sure you will." Luis lit his cigarette, exhaled smoke into the morning air. "That's why you've got that look on your face, like a man walking into a fight he knows he can't win." Caleb didn't have an answer to that, so he just finished his coffee and went to saddle his horse. By the time he reached the Harper farm, the wind had picked up and the clouds had rolled closer, turning the sky the color of old iron. He found Nora in the garden they'd replanted 2 days ago, frantically trying to rig up some kind of cover using old canvas and pieces of broken fence post. She looked up when she heard his horse, and the expression on her face went from surprise to something more complicated, relief mixed with that ever-present wariness. "I'm not here for charity," she called out, even as the wind whipped her hair loose from its pins. "I'm just trying to protect the plants before... Storm's going to tear that canvas to pieces in the first strong gust," Caleb said, dismounting. "And that's the least of your problems." He pointed at the house, where several roof shingles had already come loose and were flapping in the wind like dying birds. Even from here he could see gaps in the roof boards underneath, gaps that would let water pour straight through when the rain started. Nora followed his gaze and her face went pale. "I know. I've been trying to patch it, but I don't have enough—" She stopped, jaw clenched against what might have been tears or fury. "I've got buckets inside. I'll just have to catch the water." "And when the whole thing caves in?" "It won't." "Nora." He used her name without thinking, and something flickered in her eyes at the informality. "That roof's been neglected for years. You've got rot in the support beams. I'd bet money on it. Add the weight of water-soaked wood in a heavy rain, and..." "And what?" she snapped. "What exactly do you suggest I do? I can't afford repairs. I can barely afford to eat. So unless you've got a magic solution, I'm going to do what I've been doing, make do with what I have, and pray it's enough." Thunder rumbled in the distance, deep and ominous. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering in the dust. Caleb looked at the house, then at the woman standing defiant in the garden with rain starting to darken her dress, then back at the house. He was already calculating how many support beams would need replacing, how much lumber it would take, whether the whole structure could even be saved, or if they'd be better off building something new. "You can't save everyone," a voice in his head warned. "You can't fix everything that's broken." But he was looking at Lily's face in the window, small and frightened as she watched the storm approach, and he knew he was going to try anyway. "Get inside," he told Nora. "Pack what you can carry, clothes, food, anything you can't afford to lose. You and Lily are coming with me." "What? No, I'm not asking you to abandon anything, but that roof isn't going to hold, and I'm not leaving you here to find out what happens when it doesn't." He grabbed the canvas she'd been struggling with and started unhooking it from the makeshift frame. "We'll move you to the barn for tonight. It's got better shelter than the house. Tomorrow, when the storm passes, I'll come back with lumber and we'll fix the roof proper. You'll..." She stared at him like he'd started speaking another language. "You can't just fix my roof. That's weeks of work. I told you I can't pay..." "Then don't pay." The rain was coming harder now, and Caleb had to raise his voice over the rising wind. "We can argue about money later. Right now, I need you to trust me enough to get your daughter to safety." For a long moment she just stood there, rain plastering her hair to her face, pride and desperation at war in her expression. Then Lily appeared in the doorway, calling "Mama" in a small, scared voice, and the decision made itself. "All right," Nora said. "All right, but we're only going to the barn. And tomorrow, I'm helping with whatever repairs you think need doing. Deal. They worked fast, racing against the darkening sky. Nora gathered clothes and the few bits of food she had stored while Caleb checked the barn's structure. It was rough. Half the roof was gone and most of the stalls were rotted through, but there was one corner that was relatively sound, with enough overhead cover to keep them dry. He piled up some old hay bales to make a windbreak, spread the canvas over the driest section of floor. By the time Nora and Lily arrived with their arms full of belongings, the rain was coming down in sheets and thunder was shaking the ground beneath their feet. "Up in the loft!" Caleb shouted over the storm. "It's drier and safer if anything collapses." He helped them up the ladder. Lily first, then Nora with her bundle of possessions, then himself with their few supplies. The loft was cramped and dusty, but it was dry and the roof overhead looked solid enough. Through the gaps in the barn walls, they could see the house, already looking ghostly in the storm's fury. Lily pressed against her mother's side, her small body trembling. Nora wrapped an arm around her daughter and pulled her close, but Caleb could see the fear in both their faces as the wind howled and the rain hammered down. "It's going to be all right," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. Then lightning split the sky with a crack so loud it felt like the world breaking open. The house lit up stark white in the flash, and in that moment of terrible clarity, Caleb saw one of the main support beams on the porch give way. The roof sagged, timbers screaming protest that carried even over the storm. "Oh God," Nora whispered. "Oh God, if we'd been in there." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They all understood how close it had been. The storm raged for hours. They huddled together in the loft while the wind tried to tear the barn apart around them, and rain found every crack and gap in the old wood. Lily eventually fell asleep despite the noise, exhausted by fear and curled up on the canvas with her head in her mother's lap. Nora stroked her daughter's hair with one hand while the other gripped a support beam so tight her knuckles showed white. "This is my fault," she said quietly, barely audible over the storm. "I should have left. Should have gone somewhere else, anywhere else. But I was so stubborn, so determined to prove I could make it work here, and I almost got her killed. You didn't know the roof would fail. I knew it was bad. I just kept telling myself one more day, one more week, I'll find a way to fix it." She let out a shaky breath. "My husband, he told me this place would be our future. Good land," he said. "Good opportunity. He bought it with borrowed money and promises, and I believed him because I wanted to believe we could have something stable, something ours." Her voice hardened. "Turns out it was just another one of his gambles. And like all his gambles, we lost." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He'd known men like her husband, men who confused hope with planning, who believed luck was a strategy. They usually left wreckage in their wake. "You're not him," he said finally. "You're still here, still fighting. That counts for something." "Does it?" She looked at him in the darkness, her face barely visible in the dim light filtering through the barn walls. "Sometimes I think it would be easier to just give up, let the town have what they want, admit defeat and disappear. But you don't." "No, I don't." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Too proud, I guess, or too stupid. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." Another crack of lightning lit up the loft. And in that flash, Caleb saw the exhaustion etched deep in her features, the weight of carrying everything alone for so long. He found himself wanting to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he kept his hands to himself. They barely knew each other. He had no right. "Why are you helping us?" Nora asked into the darkness. "And don't say it's just being neighborly. Nobody rides through a storm like this just to be neighborly." It was a fair question. Caleb had been asking himself the same thing, and he still didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he did, but it was tangled up with memories and old wounds he didn't like examining too closely. "Had a sister once?" he heard himself say. "Sarah. She was younger than me by 3 years. When our father died and things got bad, I did what I could to take care of her, but I was just a kid myself. Couldn't do much." He paused, the old guilt rising up like it always did. "Town we lived in, they looked at us like we were trash. Like being poor was something catching, something they didn't want near them. People would cross the street to avoid us. Store owners would watch us like we were going to steal something. And nobody, not one person, helped when my mother got sick. What happened to her? Your sister? She got lucky. A traveling preacher and his wife took pity on us, took Sarah with them when they left town, gave her a chance at something better. He looked down at Lily's sleeping form. But I remember what it felt like before that, when we were alone and hungry and nobody cared if we lived or died. So when I see a child in that position, I guess I can't help but... He shrugged, unable to finish. Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "You're a better man than you give yourself credit for." Just trying to be better than I was. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? The storm began to ease around midnight, the thunder moving east and the rain settling into a steady drumming instead of a deluge. Caleb watched through the gaps in the barn walls as the clouds started to break apart, revealing patches of clear sky and a moon that painted everything in silver light. The house was still standing, but barely. The porch roof had collapsed completely, and even from the barn he could see water pouring through holes in the main roof. By morning, the inside would be a wreck, everything soaked, probably mold already starting in the walls. "You can't stay here," he said, more to himself than to Nora. But she heard him. "I don't have anywhere else to go. Come to my ranch." The words were out before he'd fully thought them through. He felt her stiffen beside him in the darkness. "What?" "My ranch. It's safe, it's dry, and it's got room. You and Lily can stay there while we fix this place up, or..." He hesitated, then pushed forward. "Or until you figure out what you want to do next." "I can't." Her voice was sharp with panic. "Do you have any idea what people would say? A widow staying at a bachelor's ranch? They already think..." She stopped herself, but Caleb could fill in the rest. "Let them think what they want." Easy for you to say. "You're not the one they'll call." She bit off the word, but it hung between them anyway. "Whore." That's what they'd call her. That's what they probably already whispered when she walked past. "Then we'll make it proper," Caleb said. "Luis lives on the property, has for years. His cabin's close to the main house. He can chaperone, or whatever you want to call it. Nobody can say anything improper's happening with a 60-year-old Mexican grandfather watching every move. People can say anything. People will say anything. Let them." He turned to face her fully, trying to make her understand. "Nora, that house is going to take weeks to repair, and that's if the structure's even salvageable. You can't live in this barn. There's no water, no kitchen, barely any walls. Lily needs..." "I know what my daughter needs," Nora snapped. Then, quieter. "I know." They sat in heavy silence while the rain continued its steady percussion against the barn roof. Lily stirred in her sleep, making a small sound of distress, and Nora automatically stroked her hair until she settled again. "If I say yes," Nora said finally, "it's temporary. Just until the house is fixed." "All right. And I work for my keep. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, whatever needs doing. I'm not staying there as a charity case. Wouldn't expect you to. And if the talk gets too bad, if it starts affecting your reputation or your business, we leave immediately. No arguments." Caleb wanted to protest that last condition, but knew it would be pointless. Nora's pride was the steel spine holding her upright, and he wasn't about to ask her to bend it any further. "Deal," he said. She let out a long, shaky breath. "All right then. But I want it understood. This doesn't mean... I'm not..." She struggled for words, and he understood what she was trying to say. "I know. I'm not expecting anything, Nora. Just trying to help." "Why, though?" The question came out almost plaintive. "Why do you care so much?" "Because when I look at you, I see someone fighting to survive with nothing but will and pride, and I know what that costs. Because your daughter reminds me of my sister, and I couldn't save her, but maybe I can help you. Because in a world full of people who turn away, I'm tired of being one of them." But he didn't say any of that, just said, "Because it's the right thing to do." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. They stayed in the barn the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch to make sure nothing collapsed. When dawn finally broke gray and pale, they climbed down from the loft to survey the damage. The house looked even worse in daylight. The porch roof had caved in completely, taking part of the front wall with it. Water had poured in through multiple holes in the main roof, and when Caleb cautiously stepped inside, his boots splashed in an inch of standing water. The ceiling was sagging dangerously in several places, plaster cracked and hanging in sheets. Everything inside was soaked: furniture, clothing, what little food had been stored in the small pantry. Nora stood in the doorway with Lily clutched to her side, staring at the ruins of her home with an expression that was beyond devastation. She'd cried all her tears already, Caleb realized. Now there was just numb acceptance. "Can it be fixed?" she asked dully. Caleb walked through the space slowly, testing beams, checking foundations, assessing the damage with the practical eye of someone who'd built and repaired more structures than he could count. The news wasn't good. "Maybe," he said carefully. "The foundation's solid, and some of the framing can be salvaged. But you're looking at replacing most of the roof, rebuilding the front wall, probably tearing out all the interior walls to check for rot and mold." He turned to face her. "It's possible, but it'll take time, weeks, maybe months, and materials, which cost money I don't have. We'll figure it out." "Will we?" She laughed, a broken sound without humor. "How exactly are we going to figure it out, Caleb? I have nothing. Less than nothing. I can't pay you for lumber, can't pay you for your time, can't pay for anything. All I have is—" She gestured helplessly at the wreckage around them. "This. And it's not enough. It was never enough." Lily started crying, quiet tears streaming down her small face. Nora immediately knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. "It's all right, baby. It's all right. We'll figure something out. We always do." But over her daughter's head, her eyes met Caleb's, and the despair in them was so profound it hurt to witness. He thought about his ranch, about the lumber stacked in his barn from a shed he'd torn down last year, about the money he'd been saving to buy breeding stock that could just as easily pay for supplies, about Luis's words that morning. "You know what you're getting into?" No, he didn't. He really didn't. But he knew what happened if he walked away. He'd see it in his dreams for the rest of his life. A woman and child standing in the ruins of their home while he rode back to his comfortable ranch and told himself it wasn't his problem. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "Today, you and Lily come back to my place. We'll get you settled, get some real food in that girl, let you both rest. Tomorrow, I'll come back here with Luis and we'll start the salvage work. Pull out what can be saved, tear down what can't. Then we'll sit down and make a real plan for rebuilding. Caleb, I've got lumber," he continued, talking over her protests. "And I know how to use it. Luis is a master carpenter, learned from his father, who learned from his. Between the two of us, we can do most of the work. You help where you can, learn as you go. And yes, eventually you pay me back if that's what you need to do. But right now, today, you let me help because your daughter is cold and hungry and scared. And that's more important than your pride or my money or what anyone in town thinks." Nora stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes, the fierce independence that wouldn't bend, crashing against the desperate need to protect her child. Finally, inevitably, the mother won over the proud woman. "All right," she whispered. "All right. Just for a little while." They salvaged what they could from the house, some clothes that weren't too wet, a few dishes, a small wooden box that Nora clutched like it contained something precious. Then they loaded everything onto Caleb's horse, Lily riding in front of him while Nora walked alongside. The ride back to Caleb's ranch took most of the morning. Lily fell asleep against his chest, exhausted by the night's terror, while Nora walked in silence, her face set in an expression that discouraged conversation. Caleb let her be. She'd been through enough without him trying to fill the silence with empty words. Luis was waiting when they arrived, and if he was surprised to see Caleb returning with a woman and child in tow, he hid it well. He just nodded, said "ma'am" to Nora, and helped unload their meager possessions. "Storm hit her place hard," Caleb explained. "They'll be staying here for a while." "Good," Luis said simply. Then to Nora, "You hungry? I was just about to make dinner." Something in Nora's rigid posture eased slightly at the matter-of-fact acceptance. "I can cook, if you'll show me the kitchen. Can't have a guest cooking her first meal here. Against hospitality rules." Luis's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile. "But tomorrow you can fight me for the skillet if you want." Caleb showed them to the spare room. It was small, but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the valley. Nora stood in the doorway staring at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "The bed's big enough for both of you," Caleb said. "There's blankets in the chest, and the water pump is just outside the back door. Luis will show you where everything is." "Thank you." The words came out rough, as if her throat had tightened around them. I can't." "Don't," Caleb said gently. "You don't need to say anything. Just rest. That's enough." That night, after Lily had been fed and put to bed, and Nora had finally allowed herself to sit down at the kitchen table with a plate of Luis's stew, Caleb found himself watching her from across the room. She ate slowly, mechanically, like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to have enough food. There were shadows under her eyes deep enough to drown in, and her hands shook slightly as she lifted the spoon. But she was here, safe. Her daughter was sleeping in a dry bed with a full stomach, and tomorrow they'd start figuring out what came next. Luis caught Caleb's gaze and raised an eyebrow, a question in the look. Caleb just shook his head slightly. He didn't have answers, didn't know what he was doing or where this was heading, just knew that when that little girl had hugged him in the garden 3 days ago, something had shifted in his chest that couldn't be shifted back. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking up, revealing a sky full of stars. The worst had passed, but Caleb had a feeling that the real storm, the one made of gossip and judgment and a town's small-minded cruelty, was just beginning. He'd ridden into town for grain, but somehow he'd ended up here, standing in his kitchen at midnight, watching a widow try to hold herself together with nothing but stubbornness and will, and wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. And despite everything, despite the complications and the gossip and the trouble he could see building on the horizon like another storm, he didn't regret a single decision that had led him to this moment. Not one. The first week passed in a strange sort of rhythm that felt both foreign and oddly natural. Nora woke before dawn each morning, unable to break the habit of survival that had governed her life for so long. She'd find Caleb already in the kitchen, coffee brewing, and they'd share the quiet darkness before the day demanded words. Then he'd ride out to work the ranch while she threw herself into making herself useful, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, mending clothes that barely had holes, cooking meals elaborate enough to justify her presence. Luis watched this with the amused patience of someone who'd seen plenty of proud people try to outwork their shame. On the third day, he cornered her by the water pump. "You keep cleaning like that, you're going to scrub the paint off the walls," he said mildly. Nora's hand stilled on the shirt she was washing. "I need to earn my keep." "You already do. That stew you made last night? Best meal I've had in 5 years." And Caleb's been walking around with his shirts actually mended for once, instead of held together with hope and stubbornness. Luis pulled out his tobacco pouch, began rolling a cigarette. "Point is, you don't need to prove anything. You're helping plenty just by being here." "That's not how it feels." "I know, but maybe that's something to work on, eh? Learning to accept help without thinking you owe a debt for it." The words settled into Nora's chest like stones, heavy and uncomfortable. She'd spent so long fighting, so long refusing to be beholden to anyone after her husband's debts had taught her the cost of owing, that she'd forgotten how to simply receive kindness. But old habits died hard, and pride was the hardest habit of all. That afternoon, Caleb returned from the Harper farm with news. He found Nora in the garden, his garden, where she'd been pulling weeds that didn't exist just to keep her hands busy. "House is worse than I thought," he said without preamble. "2 of the main support beams are rotted clean through. The whole structure's compromised. We're going to have to tear down most of it and rebuild from the foundation up." Nora had been expecting this, but hearing it still felt like a blow. "How long?" 2 months? Maybe 3? Depends on weather and how fast we can get materials." He hesitated. "I rode into town after, talked to the lumber mill. They'll give me a fair price on wood, and I can get most of what we need within the week." "Let me guess, you're paying for it." "It's an investment in the property. When you sell, you'll pay me back from the proceeds." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Sell? Who's going to buy a farm on that land? It's barely worth the nails holding it together." "Then we'll figure something else out." Caleb crouched down beside her, bringing himself to eye level. "Nora, I know this is hard. I know you want to handle everything yourself. But right now, you need to let someone help carry the weight. That's not weakness. That's just sense." Is it? She met his gaze and he saw the fear beneath the pride. Fear of being trapped, of owing more than she could ever repay, of building hope on a foundation that would inevitably crumble. Or am I just trading one debt for another, one man's promises for another's? The comparison to her dead husband hung unspoken between them. Caleb felt anger stir in his chest, not at her, but at the ghost of a man who'd left her so broken she couldn't trust anyone's kindness. "I'm not him," he said quietly. "I don't make promises I can't keep, and I don't expect anything from you that you're not willing to give." "Then what do you expect?" "Nothing. I expect nothing. I'm offering help because you need it, and I can give it. That's all." She searched his face for a long moment, looking for the lie, the catch, the trap. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied something, because her shoulders finally sagged with exhaustion. "All right," she whispered. "All right, but I'm helping with the rebuild. I'm not sitting here playing house while you fix my life." "Wouldn't dream of it." They started the next morning. Caleb and Luis rode out to the Harper farm with tools and determination, and Nora came with them despite Caleb's suggestion that she stay with Lily. She'd left her daughter with Luis's wife, Maria, who lived in the cabin down the hill, and had immediately fallen in love with the quiet little girl. The work was brutal. They tore into the damaged structure with crowbars and hammers, pulling down walls that groaned protest, ripping out rotted beams that crumbled like old bread. Nora worked alongside them, her soft hands quickly developing new blisters on top of old ones. She didn't complain, just gritted her teeth and kept swinging. By midday, half the house lay in ruins around them. Dust coated everything, and sweat ran down their faces in streams. Luis called a break, passing around a canteen of water. "You're going to hurt yourself," Caleb told Nora, noting the blood seeping through the cloth she'd wrapped around her palms. "So are you," she shot back. "But I notice that's not stopping you." "I'm used to this kind of work." "Then I'll get used to it too." There was no arguing with that tone, so Caleb just sighed and went back to work. But he found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye, noting the determination in every movement, the stubborn set of her jaw. She was learning, adapting, refusing to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed someone softer. Damn, but she was something. They worked until sunset, then rode back to the ranch in exhausted silence. Lily ran out to meet them, and Nora swept her daughter up despite her aching arms, holding her close like she'd been gone for days instead of hours. "Mama, you're all dirty," Lily observed. "I know, baby. I'll wash up before dinner." But when she set Lily down, the little girl turned to Caleb with those solemn eyes. "Did you take care of my mama today?" The question caught him off guard. "She took care of herself pretty well." "But did you make sure she was safe?" Something in the child's voice, the worry, the premature understanding that adults couldn't always be trusted to protect themselves, made Caleb's throat tighten. "I did," he promised, "and I'll do it again tomorrow and every day after. You have my word." Lily studied him for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. She took her mother's hand and led her toward the house, chattering about the birds she'd seen with Maria and the cookies they'd baked. Luis came to stand beside Caleb, watching them go. "You're in deep, my friend. I know. Question is, do they know?" Caleb didn't have an answer to that. Didn't even know what that was exactly. He just knew that somewhere between Morrison's store and a collapsed porch roof and a little girl's serious questions, something had shifted in his world. The careful isolation he'd built around himself was cracking, letting in light and warmth and complications he'd never asked for. And the terrifying part was how little he wanted to stop it. That night, after dinner, Nora found him on the porch. He'd taken to sitting out here after everyone went to bed, smoking the occasional cigarette and watching the stars. She appeared like a ghost in the darkness, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too much to think about." She leaned against the porch rail, her face shadowed but her eyes catching starlight. "Caleb, about today, you worked hard, did good work too. That's not what I wanted to say." She took a breath. "I wanted to apologize for being so prickly, so defensive about accepting help. You've been nothing but kind, and You keep protecting yourself," Caleb interrupted gently. "Nothing wrong with that. World taught you to be careful. Can't fault you for learning the lesson." Maybe, but there's a difference between being careful and being so closed off you can't recognize genuine kindness anymore. She wrapped her arms around herself. My husband, he was charming, said all the right things, made all the right promises, and I believed him because I wanted to believe we could have something good. Then I learned that charm and promises are easy. Following through is what matters. So when someone actually follows through, you don't know how to handle it. Exactly. A sad smile touched her lips. Isn't that pathetic? Someone does what they say they'll do, and I'm so shocked I don't know how to respond. Not pathetic, just hurt. Caleb stubbed out his cigarette, choosing his next words carefully. Nora, I'm not expecting gratitude or apologies or anything else from you. You're here because you needed help and I could offer it. That's the whole story. You don't owe me anything beyond what we agreed. You work, you help out, and when the house is done, you figure out your next step. Simple as that. Nothing's ever that simple. Maybe not, but it can be clearer than you're making it. She was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb could hear the night sounds around them, crickets chirping, the distant sound of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass. Finally, she said, "Why aren't you married?" The question came out of nowhere, and Caleb felt his defenses rise automatically. That's a personal question. You've seen me at my absolute lowest. I think I've earned some personal questions. Fair point. He considered deflecting, but there was something about the darkness and her honesty that made him want to match it with his own. Never found anyone who could handle ranch life, he said. Or maybe I never looked that hard. This place takes everything you've got, all your time, all your energy. Didn't seem fair to ask someone to share that kind of life. That's a very practical answer, but I don't think it's the whole truth. Damn, she was sharp. Caleb shifted, uncomfortable with the direction this was heading. Maybe I got used to being alone. Started preferring it. Less complicated that way. Lonelier, though. Maybe. But lonely's safer than... He stopped himself, but she caught it. Safer than what? Than letting someone in and having them leave. The words came out rougher than he intended. My mother left, took off one night, and never came back. My sister got taken away. Every person I ever cared about disappeared in one way or another. So yeah, I got used to alone. Built a life that didn't need anyone else in it. And now? Nora's voice was soft but insistent. Now there's a widow and her child disrupting all that careful isolation. How's that working out for you? Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. In the starlight, she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness, and everything to do with strength and survival, and the kind of grace that came from weathering storms and still standing upright. Honestly? He said. I don't know. Ask me in a month. She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her tired face. Fair enough. They stood in comfortable silence for a while longer before Nora excused herself to check on Lily. Caleb remained on the porch, smoking another cigarette and wondering what the hell he was doing. Getting attached, that's what. To a woman who'd be leaving as soon as her house was rebuilt. To a child who wasn't his and never would be. To a situation that was temporary by definition. You're a damn fool, Turner, he told himself. But he didn't move, just sat there in the darkness, listening to the night and feeling something in his chest that might have been hope or might have been fear. Probably both. The second week brought visitors. Caleb had known it was coming. Small towns didn't let drama go unexplored, but he'd hoped for more time. He was in the barn shoeing a horse when he heard the sound of approaching riders. 3 of them, moving at an easy pace that suggested this was social rather than urgent. Luis appeared in the barn doorway. Sheriff's here. Brought company. Caleb set down the hoof he'd been working on and straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. Through the barn door he could see Sheriff Wade Porter dismounting, along with Thomas Reed and Jack Holloway. The delegation looked official and unfriendly. Nora must have heard them too, because she appeared on the porch with Lily tucked safely behind her skirts. Her face had gone pale, but her spine was straight. Gentlemen, Caleb greeted them, walking out into the yard. Something I can help you with? Sheriff Porter shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. He was a decent man most of the time, Caleb knew, but he was also elected and therefore beholden to the men who voted for him, men like Reed and Holloway. Caleb, we need to have a word. I'm listening. Privately might be better. Nothing you've got to say can't be said in front of Mrs. Harper, Caleb said evenly. She's part of this conversation, whether you like it or not. Reed's face darkened. That's exactly the problem, Turner. The whole town's talking about you having that woman living here. It's not proper. She's a guest. Her house was destroyed in the storm. I offered shelter until it can be rebuilt. What's improper about that? A widow? Living unchaperoned with a bachelor? Holloway's voice was thick with insinuation. Come on, Turner. You know how it looks. I know how small minds make it look, Caleb shot back. Luis and Maria live on the property. There's nothing improper happening here. That's not what folks are saying. Reed stepped forward, his face ugly with self-righteous anger. They're saying you've taken Harper's widow as your woman, that you're careful. Caleb's voice dropped to something dangerous. Real careful about what you say next. The sheriff held up his hands, trying to diffuse the tension. Nobody's accusing anyone of anything specific, Caleb, but you've got to understand, appearances matter. The town's already got strong feelings about Mrs. Harper here, and you involving yourself with her situation has stirred up a lot of... I don't give a damn what the town thinks, Caleb interrupted. A woman and child needed help. I provided it. End of story. Is it? Reed's sneer was back. Or is there something else going on? Maybe you figure if you play the hero, rescue the poor widow, she'll be grateful enough to... Caleb moved before Reed could finish the sentence. He had the man by his shirt collar, backed up against his horse, and the air was suddenly thick with violence, barely restrained. You finish that thought, Caleb said softly, and I'll knock every tooth out of your head. Caleb! The sheriff's hand went to his gun. Let him go. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Nora's voice cut through the tension, clear and cold as winter water. You should leave. Everyone turned to look at her. She'd moved to stand at the edge of the porch, Lily still hidden behind her, but there was nothing frightened in her posture now, just controlled fury. Mr. Turner has been nothing but respectful and honorable, she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor Caleb could detect underneath. But there was nothing frightened in her posture now, just controlled fury. Mr. Turner has been nothing but respectful and honorable, she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor Caleb could detect underneath. He offered shelter when mine was destroyed. He's working to rebuild my home with no expectation of payment. And you... She looked at Reed with such contempt it was almost physical. You dare to come here and suggest something improper is happening? You, who wouldn't sell me flour for my starving daughter? You, who watched me beg for help and laughed? Now see here, Reed started. No, you see. You want to know what's improper? Letting a child go hungry because you don't like her mother. Spreading gossip about a widow trying to survive. Coming out here to a man's property and insulting his hospitality. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. If helping someone in need is scandalous in your eyes, then I pity you. You've forgotten what it means to be human. Silence fell like a hammer. Even Reed seemed shocked into speechlessness by the quiet fury in her voice. Caleb slowly released his grip on Reed's shirt, stepping back but keeping himself between the men and Nora. Sheriff Porter cleared his throat. Mrs. Harper, nobody's saying you shouldn't be helped, but what? But I should accept that help with shame and gratitude and disappear from sight so I don't make anyone uncomfortable? She shook her head. I've spent months doing that, trying to be invisible, trying not to be a burden, trying to survive on scraps and apologies. I'm done. If this town wants to talk about me, let them talk. I'm not going anywhere. That's real brave, ma'am, Holloway said with false sweetness. But you might want to think about what all this talk will do to your little girl. Kids hear things. Kids repeat things. Be a shame if she had to grow up hearing what people say about her mama. It was a threat, barely veiled, and Caleb felt rage surge through him like fire. But before he could respond, Nora laughed. Actually laughed, though the sound held no humor. You think I haven't thought about that? You think I don't lie awake every night worrying about what this will do to her? She took a step forward, and Caleb saw tears of fury in her eyes. But I also think about what it would teach her if I let fear and shame dictate my choices. If I let cruel people chase me away from the first genuine kindness I've been shown in a year. What lesson is that? Nobody had an answer to that. Sheriff Porter shifted uncomfortably. Look, all we're saying is maybe it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay. The church, maybe, or the church turned us away, Nora said flatly. Said they couldn't harbor the wife of a sinner, so don't pretend there are other options. There aren't. There's this or there's nothing. Then maybe nothing is what you should have chosen, Reed muttered. Caleb stepped forward again, his patience finally exhausted. I want you off my property. Now. Caleb, the sheriff started. Now. Before I forget that I try to be a law-abiding man. The three men exchanged glances, and Caleb could see them calculating whether to push further. Finally, Sheriff Porter nodded. We'll go. But this isn't over, Turner. Town's got a long memory, and they're going to remember you took her side. Good, Caleb said. Let them remember. Let them remember that when a woman and child needed help, I didn't turn them away. If that makes me their enemy, I can live with that. They mounted up and rode out, leaving dust and tension in their wake. As soon as they were gone, Nora swayed slightly, and Caleb realized she'd been holding herself upright through sheer will. He moved to her side instinctively, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. You all right? No. Her voice was shaky now, the fury draining away to leave exhaustion behind. No, I'm really not, but thank you for asking. That was brave, what you said. Brave or stupid? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. She looked up at him, and he saw fear beneath the bravado. Caleb, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I told you this would happen. I told you the town would... Stop. He turned her to face him fully, his hands on her shoulders. You've got nothing to apologize for. Nothing. Those men are small and mean, and their opinions don't matter. They matter to you. Your reputation can go to hell if it means turning away someone who needs help. He realized he was standing very close to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough to feel her breath. He stepped back, trying to ignore the way his heart was hammering. This is my choice, Nora. Mine. And I'm making it with eyes open. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but if this gets worse, then we'll deal with it. Together. The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to examine. Finally, Lily's small voice broke the moment. Mama, are the bad men gone? Nora immediately turned to her daughter, kneeling down to pull her close. They're gone, baby. Everything's fine. Why were they mad at you? Because some people don't understand kindness when they see it. Lily looked over her mother's shoulder at Caleb. I understand. You're kind. You're good. The simple certainty in her voice made something crack in Caleb's chest. He met Nora's eyes over her daughter's head and saw his own complicated feelings reflected back at him. What the hell were they doing? What was this becoming? He didn't know. But watching Nora comfort her daughter, seeing the way Lily trusted him without question, feeling the rightness of having them here on his land, he knew he was past the point of turning back. The town could talk all it wanted. Let them. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you didn't fully understand them yet. That night, the tension from the afternoon lingered like smoke. They ate dinner in near silence, and afterward, when Lily had been put to bed, Nora found Caleb in the barn. He was checking on the horses, a ritual that soothed him when his thoughts were too tangled to sort. They're going to come back, she said without preamble. This isn't over. I know. You should send us away, before this gets worse. Caleb finished latching the stall door and turned to face her. In the dim lamplight, she looked fragile and fierce at the same time, like something that could break or cut depending on how you touched it. Is that what you want? He asked. What I want doesn't matter. It's what's smart, what's practical. That's not what I asked. He stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Is that what you want, Nora? To leave? She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. He could see the war happening behind her eyes, pride against pragmatism, fear against something else, something softer. No, she finally whispered. God help me, no. I don't want to leave. But I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for us. Your reputation, your peace, your standing in this community. Let me worry about that. How can I? How can I stand by and watch you lose everything because of me? You really want to know? He was close enough now to see her pulse jumping in her throat, to catch the faint scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth every risk, every cost, every damn consequence that's coming. Her breath caught. Caleb, I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. I know there's 100 reasons this is complicated and messy and probably a mistake. He reached out, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment. But I also know I can't send you away. Won't send you away. So whatever's coming, we face it, together. Tears spilled down her cheeks, quick and silent. I don't want to hope again, she said, her voice breaking. I can't survive losing hope again. It almost destroyed me the first time. Then don't hope alone. He wiped away her tears with his thumb, the gesture gentle despite his calloused hands. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, you're not alone in it anymore. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch like a flower turning toward sun. For a long moment, they just stood there, two damaged people learning to trust despite every reason not to. Then she pulled back, composing herself with visible effort. I should check on Lily. Nora, please, I need to think about all of this. He let her go, watching her disappear into the darkness toward the house. His hand still tingled where he'd touched her face, and his heart was doing strange, complicated things in his chest. Luis appeared from the shadows like a ghost, making Caleb jump. Damn it, Luis, how long have you been there? Long enough. The older man's weathered face was serious in the lamplight. You're falling for her? It wasn't a question. Caleb couldn't deny it, so he didn't try. Yeah, I think I am. And her? I don't know. Maybe. Too early to tell. Not too early for the town to decide for you. Luis pulled out his tobacco, began rolling a cigarette. Those men today, they were just the first wave. More will come. The talk will get uglier. People will take sides, and most of them won't take yours. I know. And you're still going to do this? Caleb thought about Nora's fierce pride and frightened eyes, about Lily's trust and solemn questions, about the way his empty house had started feeling like a home with them in it. Yeah, he said. I am. Luis nodded slowly, lighting his cigarette. Then you better be ready to fight, because they're going to try everything to break you two apart. Gossip, shame, maybe worse. This town doesn't like people who break their unwritten rules. Let them try. That's what I figured you'd say. Luis exhaled smoke into the night air. For what it's worth, I think she's good for you. Haven't seen you this alive in all the years I've known you. Used to be you were just going through motions, working yourself tired so you didn't have to feel anything. Now you're feeling everything. It's good. Scary as hell, but good. Scary is right, Caleb muttered. Best things usually are. Luis clapped him on the shoulder. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we go back to the Harper place. Keep working on the rebuild. The sooner that house is done, the sooner you two can figure out what happens next. He walked off into the darkness, leaving Caleb alone with the horses and his tangled thoughts. Through the window of the house, he could see a lamp burning in the room where Nora and Lily slept. As he watched, the light went out, leaving only stars and questions. What was he doing? What were they both doing? He didn't have answers, just knew that somewhere between helping a stranger buy flour and defending her against a town's cruelty, he'd stopped being alone. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that didn't terrify him. Well, not much anyway. The work on the Harper house continued through the following weeks, and with it, the town's hostility grew like a living thing. Caleb felt it every time he rode into Dust Creek for supplies. The way conversation stopped when he entered Morrison's store. The cold stares from men who used to nod hello, the whispers that followed him down the street like shadows. He ignored it all. Had more important things to focus on, like the house taking shape beam by beam, nail by nail. Nora worked beside him every day, learning carpentry with the same fierce determination she brought to everything. Her hands grew calloused and strong, her movements more confident. Luis taught her how to measure and cut, how to read the grain of wood, how to tell when a joint was true. You're a natural, Luis told her one afternoon as she finished framing a window. Another month, and you won't need us at all. Don't say that, Nora replied, wiping sweat from her brow. I'll always need help. I've just learned to accept it without feeling like I'm drowning in debt. It was progress, Caleb thought. Small, but significant. The pride was still there, probably always would be, but it had softened into something more like dignity. She was learning the difference between accepting charity and accepting partnership, between being rescued and being supported. They were learning it together, really. Caleb had spent so long being self-sufficient that having someone depend on him felt foreign and terrifying and strangely right all at once. He caught himself thinking about Nora at odd moments, the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the sound of her laugh when Lily said something unexpected, the quiet strength that radiated from her like heat from a fire. And sometimes, when they were working close together and their hands brushed or their eyes met across the construction site, he felt something electric pass between them, something unspoken but undeniable. It was Lily who noticed it first, with the uncanny perception children have for adult complications. "Do you like my mama?" she asked Caleb one evening while they were feeding the horses. Nora was inside making dinner, leaving them alone in the barn. Caleb paused in the act of measuring out oats. "Of course I like her. She's a good person." "No, I mean, do you like her like Papa liked her? Before he got mean?" The question hit harder than it should have. Caleb set down the oat bucket and turned to face the little girl fully. She was looking up at him with those two old eyes, waiting for an honest answer. "Your papa got mean?" he asked gently. Lily nodded solemnly. "Before he died, he yelled a lot and made Mama cry. She tried to hide it, but I heard. He said we were ruining everything, that we made him lose." She picked at a splinter in the stall door. "Is that why he's gone? Because we made him lose?" Caleb's heart clenched. He knelt down so he was at her level, close enough to see the worry carved into her small face. "Listen to me, Lily. Nothing your father did was your fault or your mama's fault. Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, and sometimes those choices have consequences. But you didn't cause any of it. You understand? Then why did he leave us with nothing?" "Because he was weak. And being weak made him selfish." Caleb chose his words carefully, trying to be honest without destroying what little memory she had of her father. "But your mama? She's the strongest person I've ever met, and you're going to be just like her." "Strong like you?" "Stronger." Lily considered this, then said with devastating directness, "I hope you like Mama the good way, because she likes you, I can tell." Before Caleb could formulate a response to that, she skipped off toward the house, leaving him kneeling in the straw with his heart hammering and his thoughts in chaos. "She likes you. Did she?" The moments between them had been building, the accidental touches, the lingering looks, the conversations that went deeper than they should between two people who'd known each other less than a month. But liking and loving and wanting were different things, and Nora had been hurt badly enough that he couldn't assume anything. And what did he feel exactly? Was it love, or was it rescue instinct dressed up as something more? Was he falling for Nora herself, or for the idea of filling the emptiness in his life with someone who needed him? He didn't know. But that night, when Nora smiled at him across the dinner table, and his chest did that strange tight thing it had been doing lately, he thought maybe it didn't matter what label he put on it. Sometimes you just had to feel what you felt and deal with the consequences. The consequences arrived on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after Sheriff Porter's visit. Caleb was in town again, this time at the blacksmith's getting tools repaired. He'd learned to time his visits for when the streets were quieter, avoiding the busiest hours when he'd be most likely to encounter trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had been waiting for him. He was walking back to his horse, arms full of newly sharpened tools, when 5 men stepped out of the alley beside the saloon. He recognized them all. Ranch hands and drifters, the kind of men who hired out for violence when they weren't drunk enough to do it for free. Thomas Reed stood at the back of the group, watching with a smile that promised pain. "Turner," one of them said. His name was Brick, and his face matched the nickname, flat and hard and stupid. "Heard you're keeping company with that Harper woman." Caleb set down his tools carefully, buying time to assess the situation. 5 against 1, all of them younger and meaner than they were smart. The street was nearly empty. Anyone with sense had probably scattered when they saw this brewing. "Don't see how that's your business," Caleb said evenly. "It's our business when you're making the whole town look bad," another man said. This one was skinnier, with eyes that darted around like a rat's. "Proper men don't take in whores." The word detonated in Caleb's chest like dynamite. He moved before thinking, driving his fist into Rat-Eye's face with enough force to send him sprawling in the dirt. Blood exploded from his nose, and he went down screaming. Then the others were on him. Caleb fought like a man possessed, driven by rage and something deeper. The need to defend not just Nora's honor, but the fragile thing growing between them. He took a punch to the ribs that drove the air from his lungs, another to his jaw that split his lip open. But he gave as good as he got, his fists finding soft bellies and unguarded faces. Brick caught him with the knee to the gut that doubled him over, and someone else, he couldn't tell who, kicked his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, tasted blood and dirt, felt boots connecting with his ribs. Through the haze of pain, he heard Reed's voice. "That's enough." Just enough so he remembers this conversation. The beating stopped. Caleb lay in the dirt, every breath a knife in his side, and stared up at 5 blurry figures silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. Brick crouched down close enough that Caleb could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. "Next time, it's worse. And maybe next time we pay a visit to that pretty widow of yours. Make sure she understands her place." Rage gave Caleb strength he shouldn't have had. He surged up, catching Brick off guard and tackling him into the dirt. They rolled, trading blows, until rough hands dragged Caleb off and threw him against the wall of the building. "Enough!" Sheriff Porter's voice cut through the chaos. He stood at the end of the alley with his shotgun leveled, not quite pointing at anyone, but not quite pointing away either. "All of you, break it up. Now!" The men backed off slowly, reluctantly. Reed melted into the shadows like the coward he was, leaving his hired thugs to face the consequences. Porter walked up to where Caleb sagged against the wall, one hand pressed to his bleeding ribs. "You all right?" "Define all right. Can you ride?" "Have to, don't I?" The sheriff's face was hard to read, part concern, part frustration, part something that might have been sympathy. "Caleb, I warned you, this town—" "I know what this town is," Caleb interrupted, spitting blood into the dirt. "Bunch of small-minded cowards who'd rather beat a man in an alley than face him honest." "That may be true, but it doesn't change reality. You keep pushing, this is going to get worse." "Let it." Caleb pushed away from the wall, swaying slightly but staying upright through sheer stubbornness. "I'm not backing down. Not from them, not from anyone." Porter sighed. "Then you're a fool. But I guess you've got a right to be." He turned to the men still lurking nearby. "Get out of here, and if I catch any of you starting trouble again, I'll lock you up for disturbing the peace." They dispersed slowly, shooting dark looks at Caleb as they went. When they were gone, Porter helped Caleb gather his scattered tools. "You're bleeding pretty good," the sheriff observed. "Want me to get the doc?" "I'll manage." Stubborn as they come. Porter handed him the last of the tools. "For what it's worth, I don't agree with what just happened. But I can't be everywhere, and I can't protect you from every drunk who decides to make you his problem. Not asking you to. Maybe you should be, because next time they might not stop when I tell them to." Caleb loaded the tools onto his horse with movements that sent fire through his ribs. Everything hurt, his face, his chest, his pride. But beneath the pain was a cold, hard anger that burned like ice. They'd threatened Nora, threatened to hurt her because of him. That couldn't stand. The ride back to the ranch was agony. Every jolt of the horse sent pain radiating through his body, and by the time he arrived, he was barely staying in the saddle. Luis saw him coming and ran out to help, cursing in rapid Spanish when he saw Caleb's face. "What happened?" "5 men. Alley behind the saloon." Caleb dismounted with a groan. "Got in a few good hits, though." "Idiota, you should have—" Luis stopped as Nora appeared on the porch. Her face went white when she saw the blood. "Oh, God, Caleb." "I'm fine." "You're bleeding." She was down the steps and beside him in seconds, her hands fluttering over his injuries with a gentleness that made his chest ache worse than the bruises. "What happened? Who did this?" "Doesn't matter." "It does matter." Her voice cracked. "This is because of me, isn't it? They hurt you because you're helping me." Caleb caught her hands, stilling their frantic movement. Even through the pain, he was aware of how small they felt in his, how they trembled despite her efforts to stay calm. "This is because some men are cowards and bullies," he said firmly. has nothing to do with you. That's a lie, and you know it. Tears were streaming down her face now. This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're punishing you for being kind to me, and I won't. What? Won't what? He could feel his own temper rising, fed by pain and anger and fear he couldn't quite acknowledge. Won't accept help? Won't let anyone stand up for you? Nora, you don't get to decide that for me. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protecting. I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing and that I'm choosing this with open eyes. But look at you. She gestured at his battered face, her voice breaking. Look what they've done. And this is just the beginning. Next time it could be worse. Next time they might... She couldn't finish, but the fear in her eyes completed the thought. Next time they might kill you. Luis cleared his throat. Why don't we get you inside, patch you up before you bleed all over the yard? It was practical advice, but Caleb could see Nora struggling with the urge to bolt, to take Lily and disappear before anyone else got hurt because of her. He knew that look, recognized the defensive fear that made people run from the very thing they needed. Nora, he said quietly, insistently, don't run, please. She met his eyes, and he saw the war happening there, between fear and hope, between the instinct to protect herself and the growing desire to stay. Finally, she nodded once, sharp and decisive. All right, but we're having a serious conversation after we get you cleaned up. Looking forward to it, he lied. They got him inside and into a chair while Maria fetched water and clean cloth. Nora worked with steady hands despite the tears still tracking down her cheeks, cleaning the blood from his face and checking his ribs for breaks. Lily watched from the doorway, her small face pale and frightened. Does it hurt? The little girl asked in a whisper. Not too bad, Caleb lied again. Everything hurt. His ribs especially, at least 2 were cracked, maybe broken. But he forced a smile for Lily's sake. I've had worse. Why did they hurt you? It was Nora who answered, her voice rough but steady. Because some people are mean, baby, and they take that meanness out on good people like Caleb. That's not fair. No, Caleb agreed. It's not. But life isn't always fair. Sometimes you just have to decide what you're willing to fight for, and then stand your ground. Lily processed this with her characteristic seriousness. Are we worth fighting for? The question hung in the air like something physical. Caleb looked at this child, solemn and wise beyond her years, already learning that the world could be cruel. Then he looked at her mother, at Nora's fierce green eyes and the way she held herself like a weapon against a world that kept trying to break her. Yes, he said simply, you are. Nora's hand stilled on the bandage she was wrapping. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything unspoken between them crystallized into something clear and undeniable. This wasn't rescue or obligation or temporary kindness. This was something real and raw and terrifying. Lily, go help Maria in the kitchen, Nora said quietly, not breaking eye contact with Caleb. The girl hesitated, sensing the weight of the moment, then obeyed. When she was gone, Nora sat back on her heels, studying Caleb's battered face, with an expression he couldn't quite read. You can't keep doing this, she said finally. Taking hits for us. Fighting our battles. They're my battles too now. But they shouldn't be. This isn't your fight, Caleb. It's mine, and I've dragged you into it, and now you're hurt because I chose to help you, he interrupted. My choice, my consequences. You don't get to take that away from me. Even if it gets you killed? Even then. She made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You're insane. You know that? Completely insane. Probably. He reached up with one hand, his left, since his right was swollen and aching, and cupped her face gently. But I meant what I said before. When I look at you, I see something worth every risk. That hasn't changed. Getting beat up in an alley doesn't change it. What if next time is worse? What if... Then we deal with it, together. He stroked his thumb across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear. Nora, I know you're scared. I know trusting people hasn't worked out well for you in the past. But I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me until you decide otherwise. And if I never decide otherwise? The question was barely a whisper, but it struck him like thunder. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the desperate hope she was trying so hard not to feel. Then I guess you're stuck with me forever, he said, meaning every word. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch like she had that night in the barn. When she opened them again, they were clear and determined. All right, she said. All right. But we do this smart. No more going into town alone. No more putting yourself in situations where they can corner you. We're careful, we're smart, and we don't give them any more ammunition than we already have. Deal. And Caleb? Her hand covered his where it still rested against her face. Thank you for fighting for us, for not giving up even when it would be easier. Nothing about you is easy, he said with a smile that pulled at his split lip. But then the best things never are. She leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, so light it was barely there. But it sent warmth flooding through him that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Get some rest, she said, standing. I'll make dinner and bring you a plate. Nora. Rest, Caleb. Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor. Close enough. She smiled, and it transformed her whole face, made her look younger and less haunted. Now stop arguing and do what I say. He watched her go, feeling something shift and settle in his chest. The pain from his ribs was still there, sharp and insistent, but beneath it was something stronger, something that felt suspiciously like happiness. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the ranch was quiet, Caleb lay awake staring at the ceiling and taking inventory of everything that had changed in the past month. A month ago, he'd been alone, self-sufficient, his life ordered and predictable. Now his ribs were cracked, his reputation was in tatters, and he had a widow and her daughter living under his roof. And he'd never been happier. It was insane. Luis was right about that. But maybe the best things in life required a little insanity. Maybe safety and comfort were overrated when compared to the fierce joy of mattering to someone, of being needed and wanted not for what you could provide, but for who you were. Through the thin walls, he could hear Nora moving around in the next room, settling Lily for the night with soft murmurs and the creak of bed springs. The sounds were domestic and familiar, and they filled the empty spaces in his house with something that felt like home. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring new challenges. The town wouldn't stop, and neither would men like Reed and his hired thugs. But tomorrow felt manageable in a way it hadn't before, because now he wasn't facing it alone. The next few days passed in tense calm. Caleb's ribs healed slowly, the bruises fading from purple to yellow-green. Nora watched him like a hawk, ready to intercede if he tried to do too much too soon. It was annoying and endearing in equal measure. They worked on the house when Caleb was strong enough, making steady progress. The frame was complete, the roof nearly done. Another month, maybe 2, and it would be livable again. The thought should have pleased him. Mission accomplished, problem solved. But instead, he felt a growing dread at the idea of Nora and Lily leaving. It was Luis who finally called him on it. You know she's going to have to go back eventually, the older man said one evening while they were checking the fence line. That's the whole point of rebuilding the house. I know. Do you? Because you've been walking around like a man facing execution. Caleb couldn't deny it. I just got used to having them here. You got used to having her here. There's a difference. Luis gave him a knowing look. Question is, what are you going to do about it? What can I do? Her house will be done, she'll move back, life goes on. Or you could tell her how you feel. Ask her to stay. Actually fight for what you want instead of just accepting whatever happens. It's not that simple. It never is, but it's not as complicated as you're making it either. Luis paused to light a cigarette. You love her? The question should have been harder to answer, should have required thought and consideration. Instead, Caleb heard himself say, Yeah, I do. Then tell her, idiota, before it's too late. But telling her meant risking everything, meant putting words to feelings that, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. What if she didn't feel the same? What if she saw him as a benefactor, a friend, but nothing more? The rejection would kill something in him he was only just discovering he had. So he stayed silent, and the days slipped by like water through fingers. It was Lily who forced the issue. She found Caleb in the barn one afternoon, her small face set with determination. I need to ask you something important. All right. He set down the saddle he'd been oiling. What is it? Are you going to marry my mama? Caleb felt his heart stop, then start again at double speed. That's a big question, Lily. It's a yes or no question. Adults make it complicated, but it's not. She crossed her arms, looking disturbingly like her mother. I heard Maria talking to Luis. She said you're in love with Mama and that you should marry her before she goes back to the old house. So I'm asking, are you? Caleb struggled for words that wouldn't lie to this child, but wouldn't make promises he couldn't keep. Your Mama and I, we care about each other, but marriage is... Do you love her? Yes. Does she make you happy? Yes. Do you want us to stay forever? Yes. Lily nodded, satisfied. Then you should marry her. That's what people do when they love each other and want to stay together forever. If only it were that simple. If only love was enough without all the complications of pride and fear and a past full of broken promises. It's not just about what I want, Caleb said gently. Your Mama has to want it too, and she's been hurt before. She might not be ready to trust someone again. She trusts you, I can tell. Lily stepped closer, looking up at him with those serious eyes. And I want you to be my papa, a real one, not like the one who left. Is that okay? The words hit him like a physical blow. This child who'd been through so much, who'd learned too young that adults couldn't always be trusted, was offering him something precious and fragile. The chance to be the father she deserved. Lily, he said, his voice rough with emotion, it would be the greatest honor of my life to be your papa. She smiled, a real bright smile that transformed her face, and threw her arms around him. He held her carefully, mindful of his still healing ribs, and felt something click into place in his heart. This was his family. These two fierce, damaged, beautiful people. They were his, and he was theirs, and everything else was just details to be worked out. Now he just had to convince Nora of that. That evening, after dinner, Caleb found her on the porch watching the sunset. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed in a way it rarely was during the day. He almost hated to disturb the moment, but Luis's words echoed in his head. Tell her before it's too late. Can we talk? He asked. She looked up, immediately alert. Is something wrong? No, maybe. I don't know. He sat down beside her, suddenly unsure how to begin. Nora, the house is almost done. Something shuddered in her expression. I know. Another month, maybe less. We'll be out of your hair soon. That's not what I... He stopped, frustrated with his own inability to say what he meant. What if you didn't go back? She turned to look at him fully. What? What if you stayed here? You and Lily, permanently. Caleb, I can't keep imposing on your hospitality forever. You've done so much already, and I'm not talking about hospitality. He took her hand, holding it gently despite the way his pulse was hammering. I'm talking about building something here, together, you and me and Lily. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by fear. You're talking about marriage. Eventually, maybe, if you wanted. But right now I'm just talking about not leaving, about making this your home, not temporarily, but for real. She pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. You can't mean that. You barely know me. I know enough. He stood too, keeping space between them but holding her gaze. I know you're strong and proud and fiercely protective of your daughter. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know that when you smile, really smile, it lights up everything around you. And I know that somewhere in the past month I fell in love with you. She made a sound like she'd been punched. Don't say things like that. Why not? It's true. Because I can't, her voice broke. I can't survive hoping for this and having it fall apart. I barely survived it the first time. If I let myself believe this is real and then it isn't, it's real, Nora. He stepped closer, desperate to make her understand. This is the realest thing I've ever felt. I'm not asking you to trust blind. I'm asking you to look at what we've built together and tell me you don't feel it too. Tears were streaming down her face now. Of course I feel it. That's what terrifies me. I swore I'd never let myself be vulnerable again, never put myself in a position where someone else held all the power. And here I am, completely dependent on you, falling for you, despite every promise I made to myself. You're not dependent on me. You're partnered with me. There's a difference. Is there? She wrapped her arms around herself. You have everything. The land, the money, the power. What do I have? Nothing. I'd be coming to you with nothing, and that means you could what? Leave you? Hurt you? He did close the distance now, gently taking her shoulders. Nora, I understand why you're scared, but I'm not him. I'm not going to gamble away your security or make promises I can't keep or treat you like anything less than my equal. How can you promise that? How can anyone promise that? I can't promise I'll be perfect. Can't promise I won't make mistakes or that we won't fight or that life won't throw hard things at us. He tilted her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. But I can promise I'll be here. That I'll fight for us, for you and Lily, with everything I have. That I'll choose you every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. She searched his face, looking for the lie, the crack in the foundation. He let her look, hiding nothing. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too. What if this doesn't work? What if it does? They stood there in the fading light, two people who'd been alone too long learning to reach across the gap. Finally, Nora let out a shaky breath. I need time. To think. To process all of this. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. And if I decide to go back to the house when it's done, if I can't do this? The question hurt, but he answered honestly. Then I'll help you move and I'll respect your choice. But I'll also keep hoping you'll change your mind. She nodded slowly, then surprised him by leaning forward and resting her head against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, feeling her trembling against him. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she said into his shirt. I'm so tired of being afraid. Then let me help you be brave, he murmured into her hair. Not because you need me to, but because you don't have to carry everything alone anymore. They stood like that as the sun finished setting and stars began to emerge, two damaged people learning to trust again, taking the first terrifying steps towards something that looked suspiciously like hope. The days following Caleb's confession moved with a strange quality, like time had thickened into something you could almost touch. Nora didn't give him an answer, didn't say yes or no to the question he'd laid at her feet. But something had shifted between them, some invisible wall coming down brick by careful brick. She let him sit closer at dinner, let their hands brush without pulling away. Let Lily climb into his lap after meals and beg for stories about the ranch before her bedtime. Small things, fragile things, but they felt like the foundation of something larger being built in the spaces between words. The house was nearly finished, another week, maybe two, and it would be ready. Caleb watched the completion approaching like a man watching a storm roll in, inevitable and potentially devastating. Every nail they drove, every board they fitted into place brought them closer to the moment when Nora would have to decide. Stay or go. Trust or run. He tried not to think about it, threw himself into the work with an intensity that made Louise shake his head and mutter about fools and their hearts. But thinking about it was like trying not to breathe, impossible, necessary, consuming. It was a Tuesday morning, clear and bright, when the riders came again. Caleb was in the north pasture mending fence when he heard the horses. Too many of them, moving too fast. He straightened, hand instinctively going to the rifle he'd taken to carrying ever since the beating in town. Through the shimmer of heat rising off the grass, he counted 6 riders. This wasn't a visit, this was a raid. He ran, dropped his tools and ran like the devil himself was chasing him, because in a way, he was. The ranch house was half a mile away across open ground, and he could see the riders had already reached it, could hear shouts carrying on the wind, a woman's scream cut short. Nora. Terror gave him speed he didn't know he possessed. His still healing ribs screamed protest, but he ignored them, focused entirely on getting there, getting to her, before whatever was happening finished happening. He cleared the rise above the house and saw chaos. The riders were circling the porch where Nora stood with Lily clutched behind her skirts. Luis was on the ground, blood streaming from his head. Maria was in the doorway with a shotgun, but one of the riders had her covered with his pistol. And there, sitting on his horse like a king surveying his kingdom, was Thomas Reed. Just come to deliver a message, Reed was saying, his voice carrying clear in the morning air. Town's had enough of this situation. You living here, acting like you're respectable, making decent folks uncomfortable. I'm not doing anything wrong, Nora's voice shook but held firm. I'm working, taking care of my daughter. You're whoring yourself to Turner, Reed interrupted brutally, playing house and pretending it's anything other than what it is. Caleb was close enough now to hear Lily's frightened whimper, to see the white-knuckled grip Nora had on the porch railing. He brought the rifle up, chambered around with a click that echoed like thunder. Get off my property! Six heads swiveled toward him. Reed's expression flickered. Surprise, then calculation, then something uglier. Caleb kept the rifle trained on him as he approached, his finger light on the trigger. Caleb, Reed said with false bonhomie, we were just having a conversation with Mrs. Harper here. Conversation's over. You're leaving. Now. We're not done. You are. Caleb reached the yard, positioned himself between the riders and the porch. You've got about 5 seconds to turn those horses around before I start shooting, and fair warning, I'm not aiming for the horses. One of the riders, Brick, still sporting bruises from their last encounter, spat into the dirt. There's 6 of us and 1 of you, Turner. Might want to reconsider your odds. Might want to reconsider yours. Luis had hauled himself upright, blood matting his gray hair, but his old revolver steady in his hand. Maria still had the shotgun, and now she leveled it directly at the nearest rider. That's 3 guns pointed at you, pendejo. How lucky do you feel? The riders shifted nervously, hands drifting toward their own weapons. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, and this would explode into violence that would leave bodies in the dirt. Reed seemed to sense he was losing control of the situation. This isn't over, Turner. Town's not going to just let this stand. You keeping a whore under your roof, acting like... Caleb fired. The bullet kicked up dust between Reed's horse's front hooves, making the animal rear and nearly unseating its rider. When Reed got his mount under control, he was staring down the barrel of a rifle that hadn't wavered an inch. Next shot goes through your chest, Caleb said quietly. You can test me if you want, but I promise you won't like the result. Reed's face was purple with rage and humiliation, but he wasn't stupid enough to push it further. Not with 3 guns trained on his group and the clear certainty in Caleb's eyes that he'd make good on the threat. This isn't done, Reed spat. Not by a long shot. We'll be back, Turner, and next time I'll shoot first and we'll skip the talking entirely. Now get the hell off my land. The riders wheeled their horses and galloped off, throwing dust and curses in equal measure. Caleb kept the rifle up until they disappeared over the rise, then finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Behind him, Nora made a sound like a sob breaking free. He turned to find her sagging against the porch railing, Lily crying into her mother's skirts. The fear on Nora's face was devastating. Not just fear of what had happened, but of what could have happened, what still might happen. Luis, you all right? Caleb asked, keeping his voice steady despite the rage and terror still coursing through him. I'll live. Bastard clipped me with his pistol when I tried to stop them. Luis touched the wound gingerly, wincing. They came for her, Caleb. Specifically for her. Said they were going to teach her a lesson, make her understand her place. The words ignited something murderous in Caleb's chest. He looked at Nora, saw her fighting to hold herself together for her daughter's sake, and knew with absolute clarity that this couldn't continue. Something had to change, and it had to change now. Get inside, he said. All of you. Maria, tend to Luis. Nora... He stopped, struggling to keep his voice calm. Get Lily settled. I need to think. Caleb, Nora started. Please, just give me a minute. He walked away from the house, away from the porch where everything had almost gone catastrophically wrong, and stood in the middle of his yard with his hands shaking and his heart hammering. They'd come for her. Come to his property, threatened his people, and they'd done it because he dared to help someone the town had decided wasn't worth helping. And they'd keep coming. Reed had made that clear. This wasn't over. Luis found him there 10 minutes later, a bandage wrapped around his head, and Maria's anger still clinging to him like smoke. You're going to have to make a choice, the older man said without preamble. What choice? Whether you're willing to do what it takes to protect them. Luis pulled out his tobacco, began rolling a cigarette with hands that only trembled slightly. These men, they're not going to stop. They see a woman alone, vulnerable, and they think they can do whatever they want. Reed's got half the town convinced she's immoral, and the other half too scared to speak up. As long as she's here without official protection, they'll keep pushing. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you marry her. Today. Right now. Luis lit the cigarette, exhaled smoke into the clear morning air. You get a preacher out here, make it legal and proper, and suddenly she's not a widow living in sin. She's Mrs. Turner, wife of a respected landowner. That changes everything. She hasn't said yes. I asked her to stay, and she said she needed time to think. Well, time's up. You saw what almost happened. You think they're going to give her more time to decide? Next time you might not be here to stop them. Luis gripped his shoulder hard. I know you don't want to pressure her. I know you want to do this right, let her choose freely. But sometimes life doesn't give you that luxury. Sometimes you have to make the hard call and hope love is strong enough to survive it. Caleb knew Luis was right, even as everything in him rebelled against forcing Nora into a decision she wasn't ready for. But what was the alternative? Let Reed and his thugs come back? Wait for the next attack and hope they were lucky enough to stop it? He thought about Lily's frightened face, about Nora's desperate courage as she'd stood between her daughter and 6 armed men. Thought about what would have happened if he'd been 5 minutes later, if Luis hadn't been there, if Maria's shotgun had been out of reach. The thought made him physically ill. All right, he said quietly. All right, but I'm not forcing her. I'm laying out the options and letting her choose. As long as one of those options is saying yes. Caleb found Nora in Lily's room, sitting on the bed with her daughter asleep in her lap despite the early hour. Exhaustion and fear had knocked the little girl out cold. Nora looked up when he entered, and the devastation in her eyes nearly broke him. She was so scared, Nora whispered. She kept asking if the bad men were going to hurt me. I told her no, told her everything would be fine, but I was lying. I don't know if everything will be fine. I don't know anything anymore. Caleb sat down beside her carefully, mindful of the sleeping child between them. Nora, we need to talk. I know this can't continue. I know I need to take Lily and leave, go somewhere far enough away that... That's not what I'm suggesting. She looked at him, confusion replacing some of the fear. Then what? Marry me. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Nora stared at him, lips parted in shock, clearly trying to process what he'd just said. What? Marry me. Today. Right now. He spoke quickly, before she could interrupt or he could lose his nerve. I know this isn't how either of us wanted this to happen. I know you need time, need space to make this decision properly. But Nora, we're out of time. Those men aren't going to stop. As long as you're here as my guest, as someone they see as vulnerable, they'll keep coming. But if you're my wife... If I'm your wife, I'm protected by your name, she finished, understanding dawning. They can't touch me without going through you. Exactly. So this is about protection, about legality and social standing. He heard the hurt creeping into her voice and rushed to correct it. No, I mean, yes, that's part of it, but that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because I love you, because I want you and Lily here permanently, not as guests, but as family. The timing's bad and the circumstances are terrible, but the feeling is real. It's always been real. Tears were sliding down her cheeks again. You're asking me to marry you because 6 men threatened us this morning. That's not exactly a fairy tale proposal, Caleb. I know, and I'm sorry. I wanted to do this right. Court you properly, give you time to be sure. Maybe ask when the house was finished and you had the option to say no without feeling trapped. He took her hand, held it gently. But life didn't give us that chance. So I'm asking now, in the worst possible way, and hoping you'll say yes anyway. And if I say no? The question hurt, but he answered honestly. Then I respect that. We finish your house, you move back, and I do everything I can to protect you from a distance. Post guards, talk to the sheriff, whatever it takes. But Nora, I won't lie to you. Distance makes protection harder. As my wife, you'd have legal standing, social protection, and my name. As a widow living alone, you're vulnerable in ways I can't fully defend against. She looked down at Lily sleeping between them, one small hand fisted in her mother's dress, even in sleep. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I swore I'd never marry again, that I'd never put myself in a position where someone else had that much power over me and my daughter. I know. My first marriage was built on lies and promises that meant nothing. He said he loved me, said he'd take care of us, and then he gambled away everything we had and left us with nothing but debt and shame. I'm not him. I know you're not. She finally looked up, met his eyes directly. That's what makes this so terrifying, because I believe you. I believe you mean every word you're saying, and if I'm wrong, if I trust you and you turn out to be just another man who says one thing and does another, it will destroy me, completely. Caleb felt the weight of her trust like a physical thing settling on his shoulders. She was giving him something precious and fragile, the choice to either honor it or shatter it. And she was right to be afraid. Trust was always a risk. Love was always a gamble. But some gambles were worth taking. I can't promise I'll be perfect, he said. Can't promise we won't fight or face hard times or that I won't make mistakes. But I can promise I'll never gamble with your security. Never lie to you. Never make you or Lily feel like you're anything less than the center of my world. He squeezed her hand gently. And I can promise that if you say yes, it's because you want to, not because you have to. Your house is nearly done. In 2 weeks, you could be living there if that's what you choose. So this isn't about trapping you or forcing your hand. It's about offering you a choice and hoping you'll choose me. Nora was quiet for a long time, her eyes moving between his face and her daughter's sleeping form. Caleb could practically see her thinking, weighing, trying to calculate whether this was the salvation she needed or another trap disguised as rescue. Finally, she said, "If I say yes, when you say yes," he corrected gently. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "If I say yes, there are conditions. Name them. First, the house stays in my name. When it's finished, it's mine. That way, if this," she gestured between them, "doesn't work out, I have somewhere to go. I won't be trapped by poverty or dependence." It hurt that she needed that escape route, but he understood it. "Agreed. The house is yours, free and clear. I'll have the papers drawn up. Second, I keep working. I'm not going to sit around playing the lady of the manor while everyone else does the labor. I earn my place here. You already have earned your place, but if working makes you feel better, I won't stop you. Third," she paused, vulnerability flickering across her face. "Third, you have to promise me that if I'm making a mistake, if 6 months or a year from now you realize this was all about rescue and not about love, you'll tell me honestly. I'd rather have my heart broken by the truth than live in a lie. That works both ways. If you realize you can't trust me, can't love me the way I love you, I need you to tell me. I'd rather know than wonder." She nodded slowly, then looked down at Lily again. The little girl stirred, made a small sound, and Nora automatically stroked her hair until she settled. "She asked me this morning if you were going to be her new papa," Nora said quietly. "Before those men came. She wanted to know if you'd stay forever or if you'd leave like her father did." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, that grown-up relationships were complicated and I couldn't make promises about other people's choices." She met his eyes. "But what I wanted to say was yes, that you'd stay, that you'd be the father she deserves and the partner I never thought I'd find. I wanted to say yes so badly it terrified me." Caleb felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked tight for more years than he could count. "Then say it now. Say yes." "Just like that?" "Just like that." She took a shaky breath, closed her eyes for a moment like she was gathering courage, then opened them and looked at him with something that might have been hope, or might have been surrender, or might have been both. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief was so intense it made him dizzy. He leaned forward carefully, conscious of Lily between them, and kissed Nora with a gentleness that felt like reverence. She kissed him back, one hand coming up to cup his face, and for a moment everything else fell away. The danger, the fear, the complications. There was just this, just them, just the beginning of something that felt like coming home. When they pulled apart, Nora was crying again, but this time the tears looked different, less fear, more release. "I can't believe I just agreed to marry you," she said with a watery laugh. "We've known each other 6 weeks. 5 weeks and 4 days, Caleb corrected. "But who's counting? Apparently you are." She laughed again, the sound genuine this time. "What are we doing, Caleb?" "Something brave. Something crazy. Something that might just work if we're lucky and stubborn enough." He stood, held out his hand. Come on, let's get married before you change your mind. Luis found a traveling preacher in Dust Creek who was willing to come out that afternoon, a Methodist minister with kind eyes and the sense not to ask too many questions about why this wedding was happening so quickly. They stood on the porch where Nora had been threatened just hours earlier, but now the space felt different, reclaimed, made new by the promises they were about to exchange. Lily stood between them in her best dress, holding a bouquet of wildflowers Maria had hastily gathered. She looked so serious, so proud, like she understood the gravity of what was happening even if she couldn't fully articulate it. Nora wore the same gray dress she'd been wearing the first day Caleb saw her in Morrison's store. She'd tried to argue that she should have something better, something more appropriate for a wedding, but he'd insisted she looked perfect. And she did, fierce and frightened and beautiful in equal measure, her hand trembling in his as the preacher opened his Bible. The ceremony was simple, traditional vows about loving and honoring through sickness and health for richer or poorer. Each word felt like a vow and a promise and a dare to the universe to try stopping them. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Caleb did so gently, mindful of their audience, and felt Nora's lips curve into a smile against his. They were married. Legally, officially, irrevocably married. And despite everything, despite the violence of the morning and the complications waiting beyond this moment, Caleb felt happier than he had in his entire life. The celebration was small, just Luis and Maria, the preacher staying for a meal, and Lily chattering excitedly about how she had a papa now, a real one who wouldn't leave. They ate dinner on the porch as the sun set, and Caleb found himself watching his new wife with a sense of wonder that hadn't quite worn off. She was his. He was hers. They were family now, bound by more than circumstances or necessity, bound by choice. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked quietly, catching him staring. "That I'm the luckiest man alive. Even with all the complications? The town that hates us, the men who want to hurt us, the fact that we barely know each other? Especially with all that," he said. "Makes it more real somehow. We're not doing this because it's easy. We're doing it because it matters." She smiled, reached over to squeeze his hand. "You're a strange man, Caleb Turner, but I'm glad you're mine." "Get used to it, Mrs. Turner. You're stuck with me now." The name settled around her like a coat, Mrs. Turner. She tested it silently, lips moving, then nodded as if approving her own decision. That night, after Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, they stood together in the bedroom that was now officially theirs to share. The awkwardness was immediate and mutual. They'd gone from guests sharing a roof to married couple in the span of a few hours, and neither quite knew how to navigate this new reality. "I can sleep in the other room," Caleb offered. "If you need more time, if this is too fast—" "No." Nora's voice was firm. "We're married, properly married, and I don't want to start this by acting like we're not." She took a breath. "But I'm nervous. It's been so long, and my first marriage, it wasn't, he didn't—" She struggled for words, and Caleb moved closer, took her hands in his. "We go as slow as you need. There's no rush. We have the rest of our lives to figure this out." Relief flooded her face. "Thank you for understanding. Always," he promised. They lay down together that night, Nora curled against his side with his arm around her, and it felt natural despite the newness, like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. She fell asleep first, exhausted by the emotional toll of the day, and Caleb lay awake listening to her breathe and marveling at how much his life had changed in 6 short weeks. He'd ridden into town for grain, just grain, and he'd ended up with a wife and daughter, a purpose beyond simple survival, and a reason to fight for something bigger than himself. The next morning brought reality crashing back. Sheriff Porter rode up before breakfast, his face grave in a way that promised bad news. "Heard you got married yesterday," he said without preamble. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Caleb said carefully. "That all you came for?" "Wish it was." Porter dismounted, tied his horse. "Reed and his friends have been running their mouths in town, saying you forced her to marry you, that she's trapped here against her will, that the whole thing is immoral and illegal." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "She chose this, of her own free will." "I believe you, but the town needs to hear it from her." He looked apologetic. I need to talk to Mrs. Turner. Make sure she's here willingly. Make sure there's no coercion involved. It's just protocol. But Reed's forcing your hand, Caleb finished grimly. Fine. She'll tell you herself. Nora appeared in the doorway, Lily tucked behind her as always. She must have heard the conversation because her face was set in determined lines. Sheriff Porter, she said formally, I understand you have questions. Ma'am, I just need to confirm that I married Caleb voluntarily? That I'm not being held against my will? That this marriage is legitimate and proper? She stepped onto the porch, every inch the lady, despite her simple dress and work-roughened hands. The answer is yes to all of it. I chose this marriage, I chose this man, and I chose to make my home here with him. Mrs. Turner, I have to ask, given the speed of the wedding, given the circumstances, given that 6 men came to this property yesterday and threatened me and my daughter, you mean? Her voice was sharp as glass. Given that Thomas Reed and his thugs have been harassing us for weeks? Yes, Sheriff, the timing was rushed because my husband wanted to protect me in the only way this town would recognize. But let me be very clear, I love him. I choose him. And if you or anyone else has a problem with that, it's your problem, not mine. The speech was magnificent. Porter actually took a step back, hands raised in surrender. Ma'am, I meant no offense, I just had to ask. And I've answered. Now, unless you're here to arrest the men who attacked this property yesterday, which I notice you're not, I think we're done here. Porter nodded, looking properly chastised. Yes, ma'am. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you found someone who treats you right. Not everyone in town is against you. Some of us remember what decency looks like. He rode off, leaving Caleb staring at his new wife with something approaching awe. Nora watched the sheriff disappear over the rise, then turned to find Caleb grinning at her. What? She demanded. You're magnificent when you're angry. Absolutely terrifying and magnificent. A smile tugged at her lips despite her best efforts to stay stern. Someone has to stand up to them. Might as well be me. Mrs. Turner, defending her family, Caleb said, testing out the words. I could get used to this. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. She walked into his arms, let him hold her close. Against his chest, she said quietly, Thank you for standing with me, for not letting them win. We're not done fighting yet. They'll keep pushing. Let them. We'll push back. She pulled away enough to look up at him. Together. Together, he agreed. The attacks didn't stop immediately. Reed and his friends tried spreading rumors that Caleb had forced the marriage, that Nora was little better than a slave, that the whole situation was scandalous. But the rumors found less purchase now. Being a married woman, being Mrs. Turner instead of the Harper widow, changed how people saw her. Not everyone, but enough. Slowly, grudgingly, the town began to accept them. Mostly because they had no choice. Caleb made it clear he'd defend his wife against any threat, social or physical, and most people weren't willing to push hard enough to find out if he was bluffing. He wasn't. The Harper house was finished 3 weeks after the wedding. They stood looking at it together, Caleb, Nora, Luis, and Lily, taking in the solid new roof, the straight walls, the repaired porch. It was beautiful work, a testament to what determination and skill could accomplish. It's yours, Caleb told Nora. Legally, officially. Papers are drawn up and filed. Whatever happens, this place belongs to you. She nodded, but there was sadness in her eyes as she looked at the house that had nearly killed her, that they'd rebuilt from ruins. I don't want to live here, she said quietly. You don't have to. We can rent it out. Or, no, I want to sell it. She turned to face him directly. I want to sell it and use the money to buy into the ranch. Make myself an actual partner, not just a wife who happens to live there. Would that be all right? Caleb felt something warm bloom in his chest. She wasn't asking for charity or accepting what he'd give her. She was asking to be an equal partner in every sense of the word. More than all right, he said. It's perfect. They sold the house to a young couple from the next county over, people with no knowledge of the Harper name or the gossip attached to it. Got a fair price, too. Enough that when Nora handed Caleb her share of the partnership papers, he could see the pride and determination burning in her eyes. Equal partners, she said. Equal partners, he agreed. Life settled into a rhythm after that. The ranch work continued: cattle, horses, the eternal cycle of planting and harvest. Nora threw herself into learning, becoming as competent a rancher as she'd been a survivor. Lily thrived, growing stronger and more confident, her solemn eyes gradually learning to hold joy instead of just wariness. And Caleb found that the isolation he'd thought he preferred was nothing compared to the richness of having people to share the land with. Family dinners with laughter and conversation. Lily's questions about everything from why horses slept standing up to whether clouds ever got tired of holding up all that water. Nora's quiet presence beside him at the end of long days, her hand finding his in the darkness. It wasn't always easy. They fought sometimes, about money, about decisions, about the scars they both carried from their pasts. But they fought fair, and they always came back to each other. And slowly the trust they'd started with grew into something deeper and more enduring. 2 years later, on a spring morning, bright with promise, Nora found Caleb in the barn and handed him a secret wrapped in a shy smile. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. The joy was immediate and overwhelming. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing when she protested that he'd make her dizzy. Lily, now 7 and impossibly wise, took the news with the gravity she brought to all important matters. "Will you love the new baby more than me?" she asked that night at dinner. "Impossible," Caleb told her seriously. "You were first. You made me a papa. Nobody gets to take that away from you." She seemed satisfied with this, though she spent the next several months asking detailed questions about what babies could and couldn't do, as if preparing for a very important job interview. The baby, a son they named James, after no one in particular, just because they liked the sound of it, arrived on a cold November morning. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn chin, and from his first breath he made it clear he had opinions about the world and intended to share them loudly. Caleb held his son for the first time and felt something click into place that he hadn't known was missing. This was what he'd been moving toward his whole life, not the isolation and self-sufficiency he'd convinced himself he wanted, but this messy, complicated, beautiful tangle of family and love and belonging. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked from the bed, tired but radiant. "That I came to town for grain once," he said. "Seems like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago. We're different people now. Better ones. Definitely better." She reached out and he took her hand, careful of the sleeping baby in his other arm. "Thank you, Caleb, for not giving up on us, for fighting when it would have been easier to walk away. Never crossed my mind. Liar," she smiled. "But I love you anyway. Love you too, both of you, all of you." He looked around at his family, Nora exhausted and happy, Lily asleep in the chair beside the bed, the new baby breathing softly against his chest, and felt something he'd never expected to feel. Complete. Years passed, the ranch prospered. Lily grew into a strong young woman who rode like she'd been born on horseback and had her mother's fierce determination and her father's